Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm Deziel and today I'm showing you how to do princess lines. Before to start, I want to tell you that I did prepare a little PDF document that I'll place in my Wix site with all the instruction with the 4 princess line that I'm showing you today. I'm going to start with the basic one that is a style line from the shoulder all the way to the waist, passing by the apex. For all these styles, we're not going to do plan, we're going to do the pattern right away. I will be starting with the front, and if you trace your dart on your block, you're going to see already your pattern piece. That's why we don't need to do a plan. You have the first side of the dart and the first side of the dart that is going to belong to the center front piece. And you have the second side of the dart, that's going to belong to the side panel. To trace the pattern piece, we're going to start at the shoulder, first notch. We go in direction of the center front and we trace all the way to the first notch at the waist, and we indicate the pivot. Now we could connect the waist dart with the pivot and pivot with the shoulder dart. Now we're going to do the second piece. And since we need room to put the seam allowance, you're going to move your block a little bit and keep a space between your piece. And we're going to trace from the second notch at the shoulder all the way to the second notch at the waist. And again, indicate your pivot. And now we're going to connect the 3 points just like we did for the first piece. Then before to add your seam allowance, you might want to soften the curve on the side piece by doing a little curve at the point, and here it's only a tiny little bit that we're going in, like 1 or 2 millimeters. Now we could add the notches. I think it's a really good thing to keep the reference at the pivot level, and I usually put a second one or towards the bottom or towards the top, just to make sure that there's no confusion when it's time to sew. Here I'm going to place my notch towards the bottom at 7.5 centimeters. The grain line for my pieces are going to be parallel to center front for the center front piece, and you could just square with the waist for the side panel. Now my seam allowance are added, and for this example my center front piece is going to be cut on fold, so 1 time, and my side piece is going to be cut 2 times. Pretty much the same way we're going to do the back, so we'll trace from the first notch in direction of the center back until the first notch, but in that case you're going to have to indicate the 2 pivots. When we did the front, we had 3 levels or 3 points to connect. Here we have 4. Then we move the block a bit so we have room for the seam allowance, and you trace the second part from the second notch in direction of the side seam all the way to the second notch at the waist, and again the 2 pivots. Then we could connect the 4 dots, so shoulder, pivot of the first dart to the pivot and then to the waist. Here again we could soften the line at the bust level, and we should put notches again at the bust level on both sides, and I usually do a double notch, so one exactly at the pivot level and another one at 1 centimeter higher, because each back piece should have double notch somewhere. The grain line are going to be placed exactly like I did for the front, so parallel to the center back and square with the waistline for the side panel. This time we have to think about an opening, so since my front is on fold, I'm going to do both of my back piece, cut 2 or 1 pair. We're ready for the second style, and this one is the princess line, but that goes into the armhole. It's also called a military line. This second style is also going to be made pattern right away, no plan. But before to start tracing, you must decide where you want your style line to end in the armhole. Now with my teaching experience, I know that most of my students, they have a tendency of tracing that princess line touching the armhole notch. I think it's a mistake because first of all, this area of the garment disappear under your arm. And the second reason is that using this point for the end of your curve is going to ask you to do a very deep curve that is really hard to sew. So to have a better look, I suggest you do your ending point pretty much halfway between your shoulder and your notch. This way the line will be much softer and easier to sew. Now we're going to start tracing, but this time I'm not starting on top. I'm going to start at the waist, still the first notch, and in direction of the center front all the way to the first notch. Then you're going to take your pattern awl, place it at the pivot, then close your shoulder dart, sending the second notch on top of the first one in direction of the center front. Then you could trace from the second notch all the way to the reference you put in the armhole. And don't forget to indicate your pivot. Now we're going to trace from the pivot to the waist dart. Then you're going to take your French curve and place it touching both points. You move it until you have a nice continuous line, and then you could trace and take the reference of the number that you use, so you'll be able to report exactly the same curve onto the side panel. Now again, we'll leave a little space between the pieces, and we're going to do the side panel, tracing from that reference in the armhole on the side seam until the second notch at the waist, and you indicate your pivot. Here again, we're going to trace from the pivot to the waist notch. Then for the curve, using your French curve, you're going to use the same number that you got on the other piece. Again, if you want, you could soften the line, but always just a little bit so you don't affect too much the length of your line. For this example, I'm still going to do center front unfold, so cut 1 and 2 times for the side panel. And your notch could be also at the pivot point. For the second notch, this time I'm going to go towards the top just to help me out for the sewing, because when you do sew curve line, the two pieces have opposite curve. Now for the back, it's nice to have the same level for your cut back and front, so you could just report the level. See, I'm putting my block right at the waist, so I have my same level on the back. Now for the back here, I did use my basic block with the shoulder blade dart, so I kept it for my bodice. But you must know that in that case, you could also use the dartless back block because the armhole are exactly the same. So now using my basic block, I'm going to trace from the waist dart first notch all around, including the shoulder blade dart, all the way to my reference in the armhole, and indicate both pivot. Then I'm going to connect the pivot and the notch and use my French curve to connect the pivot to the armhole reference. Here again, I just indicate my measurement on the ruler so I could report it on the second piece. Now I move my block a little bit and I'm going to trace my side piece. You could start at the reference, tracing on the side seam until the second notch at the waist. This time only one pivot to indicate. We connect the pivot to the waist notch. Then using the same numbers, we're going to connect the reference with the pivot. Here again, we could soften the line, then place your notch at the bust level, then a double notch in the curve area, again to help you out with the sewing. Then the last thing is going to be to place a punch hole for the shoulder dart. This one is the pivot, so the punch hole is going to be inside the dart about 1 centimeter higher, and we circle it. Now for the third one, I decided to show you this military cut that goes to the armhole, but it's done with a straight line, so you have an angle here. Now for this one, you're also going to need a reference at the armhole for where you want to send your line. Here I'm going to use the same reference that I did for the other style, but you could move it around. It's up to you. It's a matter of style. And you're also going to need a second reference. This point is also a matter of style. You could do it straight, going up, or like that, or going down. It's all up to you. But when you do have the angle that you want your seam to be, you're going to indicate it on the second side of the dart. We're ready to start tracing the pattern piece. You're going to start at the waist notch, the first waist notch. You're going to trace towards the center front all the way to the first shoulder notch. For sure you do need to indicate the pivot. Then you're going to hold it with your pattern awl and close the shoulder dart. So send the second notch over to the first one. Then you're going to trace from the second notch to the armhole reference. Then before to remove the block, indicate also the reference that you find on the side of the dart. Then we could connect all the point with straight line from the armhole reference to the reference that we put on the side of the dart, then to the apex, and then apex to the waist. Now we could do the side panel. So the same way, I'm going to keep a little space in between for the seam allowance. And we're going to trace from the armhole reference all the way to the notch at the waist. You're going to indicate your pivot and the reference on the side of the dart. Then we're ready to connect the dots again. For the notch, we'll place them again at the pivot point, and it's a pretty good idea to have notch exactly at the corner. It's going to help you a lot for the sewing. Now a little precision before to go to the fourth and last style is just to let you know that what you're going to see when your garment is assembled is the line that you have on the center front piece. That's holding your style line. The shape that you have on your side panel is just going to help you create the 3D shape. The one that you will see is this one. Now the fourth style, it's only to give you an extra exercise because the best way to understand is to practice. And I think this is a pretty nice cut also. It is the princess line that passed by the apex but go right at the corner of the neckline. For this one, we don't need to add any reference on the contour of the block because we're going to use exactly the neck and shoulder point. So you might start tracing right there and go all the way to the waist dart. And for sure we do need the apex point. Right away we could connect the dot, so from the notch to the apex and apex to the neck and shoulder point. We're ready for the second part. Again, we'll leave a little space between our piece. We place the block and we're going to start at the neck and shoulder point, but this time go towards the side seam until the first notch. Then you're going to indicate your pivot, hold it with your pattern awl, then close the shoulder dart, bringing the second notch over to the first one. Then you're going to trace from that second notch towards the side seam until the second notch at the waist. Then we could connect the dot from the shoulder and neck point to the pivot and then pivot to the waist notch. Here again, even if the piece move on your paper, the grain line could be traced 90 degrees with the waist. This piece will be cut 2 times, while the center front piece here I did cut on fold, so 1 time. The notch will be again right at the pivot. Then you could add a second notch towards the bottom or towards the top, but just to make sure that there's no confusion. Here you go. Now you could create all kind of style with nice princess line. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. I want to give you a very special thank you for all your comments. I see you next time.